Karoline Leavitt, Donald Trump's press secretary, has become one of the most visible defenders of a man whose past seems to grow louder the more his team insists it never happened. She stands at the podium with assurance, repeating lines about documents that were never drafted, signatures that were never written, events that never occurred. One of the strangest details often pointed out quietly by commentators is her age. In 2003, when the document in question allegedly appeared, she was a child 5 years old, too young to remember anything, too young to confirm anything, yet now expected to deny everything with absolute certainty. That contrast alone set the stage for what came next. Donald Trump has never treated comedy as harmless. To him, jokes are not jokes. They are challenges. They are threats to control. When a comedian laughs at him, Trump does not ignore it. He responds loudly, publicly, with insults meant to reclaim attention and reassert dominance. That instinct collided this week with a segment on Jimmy Kimmel Live that wasn't even centered on Trump at first. Instead, it focused on the machinery around him, specifically the people tasked with defending his narrative, no matter how fragile it becomes. Before the clip even reached its first punchline, Kimmel did something unusual. He slowed the pace. He looked directly into the camera and asked viewers a simple question, one that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with connection. He asked where they were watching from, not as a gimmick, but as a reminder that this wasn't just an American conversation. This was global. People across countries were watching how power responds when questioned and how truth behaves when replayed. The segment began calmly. No shouting, no dramatic music, just Kimmel, a stack of notes, and a tone that suggested patience rather than attack. He introduced Karoline Leavitt as the administration's message carrier and reminded the audience what a press secretary is actually supposed to do: not dominate the room, not scold reporters, not rewrite history, but answer questions. Then he did something subtle. He played short clips from recent briefings and headlines. He didn't interrupt them. He didn't add commentary right away. He simply paused after each one, long enough for the audience to notice the gaps on their own. The laughter started quietly, then grew, not because the clips were outrageous, but because they were repetitive. The same phrases, the same deflections, the same insistence that asking a question was somehow hostile. Kimmel's point wasn't personal. He didn't mock Leavitt's appearance or background. He critiqued a style of communication that treats verification like an attack and confusion like a strategy. At one moment, he referenced comparisons being made online. People saying Leavitt might be worse than past press secretaries. Not because she was louder, but because of how aggressively she defended contradictions without acknowledging they existed. He played a clip where she dismissed a verified report, not by disproving it, but by declaring it false with no explanation. Then he paused again. That pause did more work than any joke could. Kimmel explained that what viewers were watching wasn't a debate. It was marketing. He laid out a simple test anyone could use at home. You don't need to trust him. You don't need to trust the network. Just check 3 things. What was said, what was later claimed, and what the public record shows. If a statement collapses when replayed, it isn't information. It's branding. The audience didn't just laugh. They applauded because the point didn't require outrage. It required attention. Kimmel wasn't asking people to hate anyone. He was asking them to stop rewarding fog. He made one quiet observation that became the spine of the segment. When an administration calls every question fake, it's admitting it doesn't want to answer any. That line landed hard, not because it was cruel, but because it felt obvious once said aloud. Within hours, the clip was spreading online. But as it spread, so did predictable counter-narratives. Old fabricated stories resurfaced claiming Kimmel had kicked Leavitt off his show, or that there had been a backstage confrontation. None of it was true. Fact-checkers had debunked those stories months ago. But the goal wasn't truth. It was distraction. Trump supporters tried to inflate the moment into a dramatic showdown. Argue about tone, argue about disrespect, argue about comedy, anything to avoid the substance. That playbook was familiar. Create noise so people stop replaying the tape. Trump's response followed his usual rhythm. He posted angrily, calling Kimmel a propaganda clown, praising Leavitt as brilliant, and insisting the segment proved the media feared him. The posts weren't a rebuttal. They were a flood. The idea was simple. Overwhelm the calm critique with heat. But something different happened this time. Kimmel didn't fight back. And that's where the story really began to change. The silence after Trump's post was louder than his insults. Normally, A late-night jab from a former president would trigger a volley of responses. Tweets stacked on tweets. Jokes piled on jokes. But this time, Jimmy Kimmel did something unexpected. He didn't rush to respond. He didn't trend hop. He let the outrage burn itself out in real time, trusting that people would notice who was shouting and who wasn't. That restraint changed the temperature of the moment. The following night, when Kimmel finally returned to the topic, his tone was noticeably calmer than the day before. No montage, no sarcasm-heavy setup, just a brief acknowledgement that the former president had spent his day furious about a comedy segment he claimed didn't matter. Then Kimmel delivered a single line almost offhand that reframed the entire conflict. If the segment was meaningless, why spend the whole day screaming about it? The audience laughed, but it wasn't explosive. It was the kind of laughter that comes from recognition, from seeing a pattern finally named. Then Kimmel moved on. No lingering, no extended roast. That decision mattered more than it looked. By refusing to escalate, he denied Trump the spectacle he thrives on. The insult had nowhere to land. The attention loop broke. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt stayed exactly where she was expected to stay, behind the podium. On script, she labeled the monologue Hollywood misinformation and urged the public to ignore comedians. She attempted to pivot back to policy announcements, but something subtle had already shifted. Reporters weren't asking about jokes anymore. They were asking about discrepancies, about timelines, about why certain denials were repeated instead of explained. The clip had reframed the issue. It was no longer comedy versus politics. It was clarity versus control. Could a public official treat basic verification as a legitimate part of democracy instead of an attack? That question lingered in every briefing that followed. Even commentators who disliked Kimmel's politics acknowledged something unusual. The segment didn't rely on humiliation. There was no viral meltdown, no explosive confrontation. The snap came from restraint, from watching a carefully constructed messaging strategy struggle. When confronted with nothing except a replay button. Interestingly, Leavitt showed she was capable of a different tone when circumstances forced it. After a high-profile shooting in Minneapolis, she delivered a statement calling the death a tragedy and urging investigators to proceed carefully. No slogans, no deflection, just a straightforward acknowledgement. Analysts pointed out how different it felt precisely because it lacked fire. That contrast only sharpened the earlier critique. It proved the approach wasn't accidental. It was selective. By the end of the week, the viral takeaway wasn't that Kimmel had embarrassed anyone. It was that he had exposed the tactic. Repeat, deflect, accuse, hope the audience gets tired. Because a tired audience stops checking, and an audience that stops checking becomes easy to manage. But this time, people didn't stop checking. Teachers shared the clip in media literacy classes. Journalists referenced it when explaining how to track claims across time. Viewers replayed it not because it was shocking, but because it was clear. It offered an alternative to outrage, a checklist instead of a shouting match. And that calm, methodical approach turned out to be far more destabilizing than any insult. For a political brand built on controlling the frame, the most dangerous thing wasn't mockery. It was attention that refused to be steered. Yet this wasn't the first time late-night television had done this. And it wouldn't be the last, because just days earlier, another host had asked an even simpler question, one that froze the room entirely and revealed something far more uncomfortable. And that question wasn't about policy. It was about math. The setup looked harmless at first, almost routine. Jimmy Kimmel Live opened the way it always does, with applause, music, and a desk polished to mirror shine. But the energy that night was different. There was a tightness in the room, the kind that appears when everyone senses something unscripted might happen. Donald Trump appeared via remote video from Mar-a-Lago, framed by gold curtains and flags positioned just a little too carefully, as if the background itself were part of the performance. For nearly 20 minutes, he spoke without interruption, cycling through familiar territory. He praised his own intelligence, his instincts, his unmatched understanding of numbers. He told the audience he saw math differently, that experts from Wharton marveled at his brain, that he didn't need calculators because numbers came to him naturally. He described his success as proof, not of effort, but of innate brilliance. The crowd listened politely, some amused, some skeptical, most waiting to see where this was going. Kimmel didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge the claims midstream. He tapped a pencil against his desk, nodding occasionally, letting the monologue stretch just long enough to feel indulgent. Then, at the first natural pause, he leaned forward with a look that suggested admiration rather than confrontation. He complimented Trump on his confidence, and repeated the claim back to him slowly, as if honoring it. A human calculator, a rare gift. Then came the pivot, delivered so gently it almost slipped past unnoticed. Since you're so sharp, Kimmel said, let's do a quick check. Just to put critics to rest, simple third-grade math. What is 13 times 4? The silence that followed was not dramatic at first. It felt technical, like a lag in the video feed. Trump's face froze, then didn't. His eyes darted sideways, then back to the camera. His mouth opened slightly and closed again. 1 second passed. Then 5. Then 10. In a live studio, 15 seconds is an eternity. The audience shifted in their seats, exchanging looks that said the same thing. This was real. There was no punchline yet. No music cue, no edit to rescue the moment. Just a man who had declared himself a genius. Stalled by a question most people answer without thinking. When Trump finally spoke, it wasn't an answer. It was deflection wrapped in indignation. He called the question nasty, disrespectful beneath him. He said he dealt with billions and trillions, not small numbers. He blamed Common Core. He insisted everyone knew the answer and that he wasn't going to play games. The excuses piled up quickly, each one louder than the last, but none of them changed the fact that the answer hadn't come. Kimmel waited until the noise ran out, then delivered the truth with almost embarrassing simplicity. It's 52. Donald, a deck of cards. 52 weeks in a year. The room exploded. Not with mockery, but with release. Laughter poured out, sharp and uncontrollable. The sound people make when tension finally snaps. Trump's face on the screen darkened. He claimed the audio had cut out. He said he'd said the answer in his head. He accused the show of trickery, of radical bias, of rigging the moment. But it was too late. The spell had broken. For those 15 seconds, the performance had failed, and everyone had seen it. What made the moment linger wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Kimmel didn't insult Trump's intelligence. He didn't call him stupid. He didn't pile on. He let the contrast speak for itself. If you claim genius, you accept the test. If you reject the test, the claim collapses. The clip spread instantly, not because it was shocking, but because it was undeniable. You could argue politics. You could argue bias. You couldn't argue arithmetic. Viewers around the world replayed it again and again. Comment sections filled with variations of the same realization. Confidence without competence is noise. Volume doesn't equal intelligence. Declaring brilliance isn't the same as demonstrating it. The moment cut deeper than 1,000 insults because it required no interpretation. It was a simple question and an absent answer. And as people shared the clip, another pattern became obvious. This wasn't just about one man missing a math problem. It was about a culture that rewards confidence over confirmation. A system where saying something loudly and often enough can substitute for being correct until someone calmly asks you to show your work. That's what unsettled people most. Not the laughter, but the exposure, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. By the next morning, the narrative had shifted again. It wasn't about Kimmel embarrassing Trump. It was about how rarely anyone asks powerful people to do something simple on the record. No spin, no escape hatch, just a question with a clear answer. And that realization led directly into something even more revealing. Something that didn't happen on a comedy stage at all, but behind a podium where repetition is often mistaken for truth. That's where the story turns next. By the time the laughter faded and the clips finished looping across social media, the story had already moved past comedy. What lingered wasn't the punchline, but the pattern. The math question hadn't embarrassed Trump because it was clever. It embarrassed him because it was ordinary. And ordinary questions are dangerous to people who survive on spectacle. That truth became even clearer in the days that followed when the administration's communications machine shifted into defense mode. Press briefings grew sharper. Answers grew longer and said less. And standing at the podium, tasked with holding the line, was Karoline Leavitt, a press secretary whose job had quietly become one of the hardest in modern politics, explaining contradictions without acknowledging them. Leavitt faced the cameras with composure, repeating familiar phrases about fake media, hostile questions, and unfair framing. When reporters asked about Trump's public claims, she didn't dispute the facts directly. She reframed the intent. When they pressed again, she accused them of obsession. When they followed up, she pivoted to policy. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And that's what Jimmy Kimmel had pointed out in his segment that reignited the firestorm. Not a scandal, not a secret, a method. Say it confidently. Deny it forcefully. Attack the question. Move on. Kimmel didn't roast Leavitt as a person. He barely joked about her at all. Instead, he slowed the tape down. He played clips side by side. What was said, what was later claimed, what the public record showed. Then he stopped talking and let the audience connect the dots. The reaction wasn't explosive laughter. It was nods, murmurs, the sound of recognition. Because viewers weren't being asked to trust Kimmel. They were being asked to trust their own memory. That's why Trump's response felt so familiar, and yet so ineffective. He attacked Kimmel personally, called him talentless, accused him of propaganda, insisted the segment proved fear. It was the same playbook used against journalists, judges, and critics for years. But this time it slid off because the critique wasn't emotional. It was procedural. You can't insult a replay button. You can't shout down a comparison. You can't intimidate a checklist. The following night, Kimmel addressed Trump's insults in a single sentence and moved on. No rant, no escalation. That restraint mattered. It denied the outrage oxygen. And suddenly the attention shifted again. Not to the comedian, but back to the question that hadn't been answered. Why does every challenge trigger a personal attack? Why does every request for clarity become an accusation of hostility? Analysts began to frame the moment differently. This wasn't about jokes or ratings or egos. It was about accountability fatigue. A political environment where repetition replaces explanation, where confidence substitutes for competence, and where exhaustion is mistaken for agreement. Kimmel hadn't destroyed anyone. He demonstrated something simpler and more unsettling. That calm questions are harder to dodge than loud accusations. Teachers shared the clips with students, not as entertainment, but as examples. Here's how you check a claim. Here's how you listen for deflection. Here's how you tell the difference between answering and performing. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A comedy show had become a lesson in media literacy, not by preaching, but by modeling. By the end of the week, the viral takeaway wasn't Trump versus Kimmel. It was volume versus verification, noise versus clarity. And the reason it stuck was because people recognized the pattern everywhere. In meetings, in classrooms, in workplaces, the loudest voice often isn't the most informed. The angriest response often hides the weakest position. And the simplest questions are often the ones most feared. That's why the moment endured, not because someone won, but because something was revealed. Power doesn't collapse when it's mocked. It collapses when it's calmly examined. When claims are replayed, when answers are expected, when confidence is asked to show its work. In the end, no insult mattered. No clapback lingered. What remained was the silence after a simple question. The pause that said more than any speech ever could. And in that pause, millions of viewers saw the same thing at the same time. The difference between sounding smart and being prepared. The difference between control and composure. The difference between spectacle and substance. And once you see that difference clearly, it's impossible to go back to applauding noise alone.